Welcome back to Baxi's Musical Podcast. Today we're brought to you by Canna Provisions, an adult-use cannabis dispensary with the largest selection of cannabis products in Western Massachusetts, with locations both in Holyoke and in Lee. They offer a warm, unique shopping experience with guides rather than bud tenders. In fact, they're not just another dispensary, they're a destination. Visit cannaprovisions.com. Cannaprovisions.com. Adults 21, please, and please consume responsibly. And now it's time for Baxi's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxi's Musical Podcast.
When I was a kid, I inherited my grandfather's guitar. I didn't know how to play it, I didn't know how to tune it, and I never took any lessons. But I would fiddle around on it all the time, trying to figure out where to put my fingers and how to make the music come out of it. I was also left-handed, so I was learning to play completely upside down and out of tune. In other words, I was much better off playing the drums, which is why I'm in such awe of a guy like my guest today, guitarist, keyboardist, vocalist, Mike Keneally. Now, if you're not familiar with Mike's work, let me see if I can sum it up briefly for you. Mike Keneally was discovered by the late Frank Zappa. Mike Keneally's first professional gig was playing with Frank Zappa, where he was hired as the replacement for Steve Vai in 1988. And when Steve Vai was looking for someone to reimagine his best solo work on guitar for piano, he hired Mike Keneally to rearrange his songs and play them on a piano as a guitar player. Steve Vai and Joe Satriani would both take Mike Keneally on the road because of his extraordinary talents as a guitar player and a keyboardist and as an arranger of music. His career would take him in and out of various side projects with a list of collaborators like Frank Zappa's son Dweezil, Kenny Wayne Shepherd, and get a load of this, a brilliant 2012 collaboration with Andy Partridge from XTC called Wing Beat Fantastic. So, of course, immediately I became interested in Mike Keneally's career. Mike has released 15 solo records, toured around the world, and is now traveling with a group called the Zappa Band, all Frank Zappa alums. In fact, Mike and the band are coming to Race Street Live in Holyoke on June 14th. Mike Keneally is an outstanding musician on every single level, and so it was a real pleasure to speak to the amazing Mike Keneally on Baxi's Musical Podcast. Hey, Mike, how are you?
Good. How are you doing, man?
Very good. How are you feeling? I saw on Twitter that you posted that you had tested positive. You healing or getting through it?
Both of those things. This is my first experience with this exciting bit of business, and yeah, I'm doing okay. I'd say as of a couple of days ago, things started getting pretty darn bearable.
Having been through it, and I've said this before, but the last thing I want to do is get it a second time. So one and done for me. I hope it's the same for you.
I feel like I've learned my lesson here.
Yeah. So the Zappa Band is coming to Race Street Live at Gateway City Arts in Holyoke on June 14th. This is a very, very cool tour that you guys have got put together. You come to the Narrows and Fall River on the 24th, and it's all Frank Zappa alums. I don't know how else you describe it, but tell us about the band and with all the other things that you've got going on in your life, why you decided to do this tour with these guys.
Well, the band was formed. We were kind of put together. It all started a few years ago when Amit had the idea to do the bizarre world of Frank Zappa, which came to be known as the Hologram Tour, but actually was a lot more than that. And the people who weren't terrified by the idea of the word hologram, if they came out to see the shows, they found that it was actually a very very varied experience with a lot of different kind of visuals, not just a simulation of Frank, although that aspect of it was amazingly well done, but there was a lot of other stuff that was going on there too. And we were the band for that. And so, that tour came to an end. It was an amazing tour. A lot of people, the people that actually did come out to see it were generally very moved by it. It was a huge experience to be a part of, but it was also a very expensive enterprise to move around with all the technology and the people required to run it. So once that was done, and we started just like realizing how much we enjoyed playing that music again, because like in the case of Robert, I hadn't played with him since 1988, and Scott Tunis I had played with only on isolated occasions. Ray White I'd never played with at all. So for all of us to connect over this music that we love so much, and once again kind of feel the power of what Frank had created, it was sort of addictive, and we decided to book some club gigs. We played at the Baked Potato in Los Angeles, just a small jazz club, and Amit came out to see us there, and Amit understandably was real interested in trying to extend this bizarre world of Frank Zappa enterprise, but he also acknowledged that it was a very expensive proposition to do so. And when he just saw us in a club playing the songs, he realized that this works very effectively as sort of an ambassador for Frank's music, which is Amit's interest is to keep the music alive and keep it out in front of people. And so he basically gave the band his blessing, the official imprimatur of the Zappa Trust, to go out and keep performing as the Zappa band. Then this dang old pandemic happened, and we didn't play for a couple of years. But then last year we had the opportunity to go out on the road opening for King Crimson for what turned out to be what's likely to be their final tour in the U.S. So that was a privilege to be there for that experience. And then it was, when you're playing any music, but especially music that's this intricate and really requires you to just occupy every aspect of it to deliver it properly. There's no substitute for just going out and playing it night after night after night. That's the way to really play the songs properly. So to go out on the road with Crimson and be delivering that music to audiences every night was very powerful for us, and it turned out to be powerful for the audience. I even think it was powerful for Crimson. They expressed to us that they thought it was a very powerful night of music, and they appreciated the fact that we were there. So it felt like something, well, we just need to do this. Even though, as you say, we all have a bunch of other stuff going on. I figured out last night, I think I'm in 8 bands right now. But it's whenever it's possible to get out on the road with the Zappa band, we all want to do it. Mostly because we love the music so much, but also we love one another. And we know that the audiences who love Frank's music are craving this stuff. So we want to get out and deliver, So we're excited because this June tour, even though it's a relatively short tour, this will be the first time that we're going out there as a headline act, which means we can just relax a bit more and stretch out and not have to worry as much about hitting a timetable. With Crimson, we had 45 minutes exactly. If we went over, we're just done.
And these are pretty intimate venues. These are very small, intimate clubs. It's a great environment to see music like this. Not every musician can play Frank Zappa's music. Not every musician goes on to play with King Crimson, although they've had just about every other musician to play in that band. But to see that in that environment, I think is just a really wonderful experience.
Well, people will be feeling the music as well as hearing it. It's like you're not going to be able to get away from it. So to be in that kind of environment with this group of guys executing this stuff, I think it's going to be equally powerful for everybody.
Last year, I had a chance to interview Adrian Belew, who also played with Frank for a while, and it's funny to me because every time. And many years ago, I interviewed Steve Vai, too, and we'll talk more about Steve in a little bit. But it seems that everyone who has ever played with Frank Zappa has got a Frank Zappa story about how they got involved with Frank Zappa. I know your story is no different, but it's such a great story. How did you come to Frank's attention?
I literally called up his office and asked for a job. And I had no professional music experience of any kind. I was 25 years old. This was late 1987, and I had heard from his hotline 818 Pumpkin that he was back in rehearsal with a new group, which was a very significant piece of information because after his 1984 tour, he had sworn he was never going to go on the road again. It was too expensive. It was just like it was too was just, he wasn't gaining enough from the experience and he was losing a lot. So he said, that's it, no more touring. And then, and after 2.5 years in his basement studio with his synclavier making computer music, which, as a composer, he loved because the computer didn't do drugs and it didn't show up late for rehearsal, and it played his music accurately every time he pressed the button. But it also didn't, surprise him. It didn't make him laugh unexpectedly. The way he put it in his autobiography was, the computer gave me everything I required from it. But unlike Ike Willis, it wouldn't just say "We're Beatrice" in the middle of a song and crack me up, So he started getting the bug for playing with musicians again, and so one day I called up the hotline 818 Pumpkin, and it said, for those of you who have heard the rumors, it's true. Frank is back in rehearsal with a new group, and my first thought was, oh, cool! I get to see another show. And then I delved a little deeper and said, you know what, this is probably going to be, it's always been my dream to play with Frank's band. From the time I was like 9 years old, I wanted to be in the Frank Zappa band. So I better take this shot, even though it's completely out of left field and I don't have a hope in hell. So I called up his office, and fortunately for me, the guy who answered the phone, his name is Jerry Fialka, and still is, believed me when I said, that I don't know if you're looking, I don't know if Frank's looking for anybody, but I play guitar and keyboard and I sing, and I've taught myself a lot of Frank's music and I'm familiar with all of it. It's like the most important music in the world to me. And I don't know if Frank's looking for anybody with these qualifications, but if he is, I'm here. And then Frank called me up the next day and said, what are you talking about? You can play all my music? And I said, well, I can play a lot of it. I've showed myself a lot of these songs, and I'm familiar with all of it. I listen to it nonstop. And he goes, you know how many songs that is? And I said, yeah, they're all in the next room. And he said, I don't believe you. Get your ass up here and prove it. That was precisely his orders to me. And then he told me a couple of songs that he wanted me to learn, both of which were really hard, one of which I knew, and the other one I had to show myself right away, which is a song called What's New in Baltimore. So I sat down and started trying to figure out this naughty thing. And the next day, my brother drove me up from San Diego to Los Angeles while I sat in the back of the car for 3 hours trying to play every Frank Zappa song in the back of the car in 3 hours. And then I walked into the rehearsal studio with the guitar in my hand, and the first thing Frank said was, "Hey, nice case," and then he just put me through my paces. He tested me to see if what I said was true. So he would name a song. And even if it was a song I had never played before, I'd say, okay, give me a minute. And I would just push the button and the jukebox in my head, because every Frank Zappa song lived there. And I'd listen to it and I'd start playing along with the song in my head. And Frank, I think he just got a kick out of that aspect of it. He saw that this was a resource that he could rely on. I think especially at one point, I was mainly playing guitar, but then he put me on the keyboard and he wanted to check my reading, which I'm not really a formally trained musician. Most of what I know, basically everything I know about contemporary music or modern rock music or anything like that, or weird experimental music, is from listening to records and teaching myself stuff. Amazing. So he put a chart for the song Strictly Genteel, the piano part, and then he sat me down at a Yamaha DX7, which is already not the most forgiving keyboard to play a grand piano part. And then he said, okay, play that. And, I knew my reading was not going to impress him, but I also knew that I had the song in my head. So I'm squinting at the chart and I'm playing the song from memory. And Frank couldn't really read any better than I could, even though he had written the stuff. So he's looking at the chart, he's looking at my fingers, and his head's going back and forth. And he goes, wait a minute, are you reading that, or are you just playing it by ear? And I said, well, I'm playing it by ear. And his eyebrow went way up, perceptibly up. So then he just shook my hand and he said, okay. At this point, the band wasn't there. It was just me and him and one other guy named Bob Rice, who was his synclavier technician. So he shook my hand and said, well, come back on Monday so the rest of the band can witness your particular splendor. And which is, the precise quote, because I remember it word for word. And that was it. I came back in a couple of days, and I had to pass the band audition, and particularly I had to pass the Scott Tunis audition, which was a lot more challenging than the Frank audition in some ways. But after a certain amount of time went by, it was just clear that I was in the band. So I still can't believe it happened.
Your first real professional gig is playing with Frank Zappa. That doesn't happen to anybody. And I mean, at what point do you stop pinching yourself and say, what am I doing here? I'm playing with Frank Zappa.
I continued pinching myself throughout the tour. It's like there were times where he was playing a guitar solo, particularly in the song Inca Roads, because while he was doing his guitar solo, I didn't have anything else to do. Every guitar solo had a specific setting. There are times where certain members of the band are playing, and there are times where certain members of the band are not playing, given what that solo's environment requires. And the environment for the Inca Road solo was very stripped down. It was basically just Robert on keyboard, Scott on bass, Chad on drums, maybe occasional punctuations from Ed on the percussion, and everybody else is just sitting out. So, and that song is so iconic, and that setting is so classic. So that would be a moment where frequently I would just sit there and have to control my breathing so as not to hyperventilate. It's like, I can't really believe that I'm here right now. So because I'm still a fan. I will remain a fan, and at times like that, it just felt like I had the most amazing seat in the house.
You were only with that band for a short period of time before he took it off the road. But in writing your own music and composing your own stuff, what did you learn from Frank, musically, or maybe just as a composer? Because he was unlike anybody else in the rock genre. I mean, he really was a maverick all to himself. And when I hear your music, I hear shades of the complexity of those songs, and clearly something stuck with you. What do you see was like the thing that lasted with you from Frank?
Well, I certainly was affected in the same way that a lot of people who went through the band were affected when they start putting out their own music, which is the early music is really heavily indebted to Frank. Like, for instance, if you listen to Flexible by Steve Vai, there are aspects of that record that really feel like Zappa Jr. And it's the same thing if you listen to my first album, Hat, which is the only album of mine that Frank actually got to hear. Is the debt to Frank is so clear on that record. With the sped up vocals and the nonstop segueing from song to song, long, extremely elaborate pieces and these tiny little punctuation pieces, and then just the fabric and the content of the songs themselves, harmonically, melodically, it sinks so deep into you. Not even just as a member of the band. I had it coming from both directions. I had no hope because I grew up a huge fan, and then I was in the band, so I was inspired by him just as as music and as a figurehead in a way. And then I got in the band, and I became inspired by the way he put music together and the way he used the resources available and what he drew out of musicians that he had. And once he saw what a musician could accomplish, he was not interested in accepting less than that. It's like, oh, you can do that? Okay, now do this much more. And that's so I was always interested in trying to challenge myself in the same way that Frank challenged me.
Yeah.
Because once I got in the band, I was like, oh my God, now I'm in for it. I have to actually play all this stuff. And there were times where he would throw me apart that I would think, oh, I can't do this. This is impossible. But the same thing happened with Steve Vai when I got in his band. It's like, I have to play Steve's guitar parts in unison with him. What the hell are you talking about? But you just do it, it's like you practice, and then the next thing you know, you've expanded your horizons, your abilities. You have proven that you're capable of more than you thought you were. It's a refusal to fail,
right?
And that sticks with me with every gig that I've done ever since, because I've played with a bunch of guys, Steve, Brendan Small, when I was in Death Clock, having to play these brutal metal things that were not necessarily a part of my skill set. I said to him, I'm not a metal guitar player. Why do you want me in this band? He goes, dude, you play with Frank Zappa, you can play anything. What are you talking about? Just do this. So then, you learn how to go and just like do things that you didn't think you had the stamina to do. And the same thing when I was playing with Devin Townsend. You're given a task, and you either do it, or you might find yourself not having a gig anymore. So it's like it was always just refusal to fail. So I think that's kind of where I was at with my own music once I started doing it. But then over time, you realize you don't want to just keep making music that sounds so much like anybody else, much less this guy who obviously had everything to do with getting my career off the ground. At a certain point, it just becomes like embarrassing in a way to sound so much like them. So you start letting your other influences in. And I was always hugely influenced by the Beatles and XTC and Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and They Might Be Giants and Joni Mitchell and all this stuff that is just amazing. That I started wanting to filter more of their influence through, and then this soup just started to brew, and after a while I think it just started to sound more like me. But I undoubtedly there's always going to be a strong influence from Frank in there, because he in some ways was the strongest influence of all on what I did, and he meant so much to me when I was growing up. He's such a significant figure in my life.
I read that your first musical instrument was the Magnus chord organ, and I had one of those as a kid, and I freaking loved it. And
That's great.
I actually saw it was great. I was shitty at it, but I loved it. But I saw one on eBay the other day for as little as $24, and I thought, where is the Steve Vai Magnus organ reduction album? When is that going to come out?
He writes chords that don't show up on those buttons on the left side. It's a pretty limited palette. But for me, those buttons were just an entire universe. I learned what major chords sounded like, what minor chords sounded like, what seventh chord sounded like, what augmented chords sounded like, what diminished chords sounded like. They're all there and they're all labeled.
Yeah.
You just you push a button and you get the chord, and then you start like getting excited about the combinations. I think that really is what like put the idea of chord progressions in my head, was just going from button to button and seeing what it felt like, because music makes you feel things. Music is not like just a series of techniques. Music is not the talent required to play it. Music is sound, and the way sound affects people. So I think that's what my relationship with that organ was. It's just like that, really getting affected by sounds.
It's an instrument that's been long forgotten, needs to be revived. For $24, I think maybe you're the guy to do it.
I think you might be right about that. If we find ourselves bidding against each other, we'll know what happened.
I did want to ask you about the Steve Vai stuff, the reduction, the piano reductions, Volume 1. I had a chance to listen to it over the last couple of days, and I mean, as I'm listening to it, I'm going, how did you arrange any of this stuff? Because I mean, Steve Vai is Steve Vai, and I know you as a guitar player. I don't necessarily think of you as a keyboard player, but your interpretation of these songs was really remarkable. That could not have been an easy thing to do.
It wasn't. It to this day, I think remains the hardest single project I've been a part of, which is why after spending years trying to prepare for a second volume of piano reductions, I realized I'm never going to have the time. And I went to Steve, and he very magnanimously released me from that obligation. Although I did end up doing several arrangements for a second album. But it was, he just gave me a list of songs and then gave me my head to do whatever I wanted to. So it was just about, it was all very gut decisions, very, very instinctive responses. For each song, I would say, do I want to just present this in a very sort of almost verbatim fashion and play exactly what he wrote the way he wrote it? Or am I going to experiment and reharmonize things and go off? And the first one that I took on was, because I couldn't wait to dig my fingers into it, was Salamanders in the Sun, which was at the time my favorite Vi composition, might still be. It's just a beautiful song, and I thought that it was one that really lent itself to some creative reharmonizing of the melody. So I just went off the charts, literally way off the charts in terms of the chord progressions and the settings for the melody in that song. And then at that point, it's just about, I hope Steve doesn't mind, because I had to spend weeks and weeks coming up with this new arrangement. And I was living in San Diego. So the process was I would be sitting in my house in San Diego, coming up with these arrangements. And then I would go drive up to Los Angeles and play them for him. And if he approved, then I would go back down to San Diego to a recording studio that had a very beautiful Yamaha Grand. And we were recording on analog tape. So I would do multiple takes of the song, and then bring the tapes back up to Steve, and then he would transfer the tape to digital, and he would edit from one take to another. He would say, just give me multiple renditions so that he could then piece together what he considered to be the ideal performance from the different performances that I did. And I delivered him the entire tapes, and the tapes contained a number of incomplete takes where I would make a mistake and loudly swear at the piano. So he would be listening and blissing out on whatever I was doing, and then I would screw up and go so and what he ended up doing was snipping out every time I swore at the piano and making this edit collage of all of these things, which he has threatened to release.
He should have included that in the album. What a great bonus track that would have been.
Track. Maybe back in those days, sometimes you would have to rewind before the first track.
Like the Beatles' Inner Groove, it never ends. It's just Mike Keneally continuing to exactly. Actually, the interesting part about that album for me is I have to believe Steve Vai had to have an incredible amount of trust in you, because it would have been very easy to put that project in the hands of someone who could, turn it into something that sounded very derivative or uninteresting. And that's absolutely not what you did. I mean, you really poured a lot into that, and to have him release it and, put his stamp of approval on it must have taken a lot of trust on his part. Cause I don't know of too many guys that would have been as dutiful to those songs and have added as much as you did.
Well, I think that's true, and that was one of the most moving aspects of that project for me, is that he did place that trust in me, and then and it was validating also, because I would come up with these arrangements. I would go up to LA and play them for him, and he would have input, but in for the most part his input was very gentle and not too transformative in terms of what I was coming up with. He liked the ideas that I was coming up with, so that was great. He pretty much just left me to it, and then he was able to he was able to impose his will once I had delivered him multiple takes of songs, and then he could choose what his favorite parts of each performance were and combine them, which was amazing for me to finally hear it back and go, geez, I guess I played that. It's still to this day when I hear it, it was just like a lot of effort, but it was love, that went into that project. It was really something.
I saw this great video on YouTube the other day. You're working on a song with the Metropole Orchestra in Holland, and the video is you kind of on the spot improvising a couple of bars, and all of a sudden, by the end of the video, everybody in this band is playing off this brief. I don't know how long it was, but they're adding to it and composing a song extemporaneously, completely by improvisation. And by the end of it, it sounds like this well-composed jazz song. I mean, tell me about. I mean, obviously, that's not how you normally compose music, or is it? How much improvisation is involved in how you write? Because I thought it was it was really amazing to see.
That was the specific brief for that project, which was the result of the executive producer of those sessions was a Dutch radio producer named Co de Kloot, who was responsible for me getting the orchestral commission for a piece called The Universe Will Provide, which was a completely composed, lengthy piece for orchestra and guitar. And then he had me come back a couple years later and he said, okay, for this time, I want you to compose on the spot for a smaller group of musicians. It was an 11-piece group as opposed to the 50-piece orchestra. And so, and I was specifically told, don't write anything until you get there. So it was improvisational in the sense that all composition is in the way, because all composition just starts with an idea that you come up with in the moment. It just so happens that most of that improvisation happens away from anybody watching and recording you. But in this instance, I had the musicians already there. So it was like, okay, give me a sec, I'll write a melody. And so I wrote a melody and I would play that and I'd say, okay, you play it. And then here, we need a harmony to that. Okay, you play this, we would figure out a harmony that needs some chords. So it was just about stepping slowly through a composition on the spot, and then fleshing it out with a couple of solo sections, and then say, okay, now we go back and repeat this bit. And it was similar to a lot of composition where you just you have to sit and make these choices. But what was different about it was doing it on the spot with a bunch of people watching, and having the process recorded at the same time. And actually, there was a second composed piece that came out of that session called Ack, which was not released at the time, but I'm finally putting it out on my next album. So there's going to be a second album a second song that was created using the same method. It was great fun. That particular song, the one that's in that video, which is called Chi, I did end up releasing on an album called Scambot 1. So it's actually a really nice piece, So I'm grateful to Ko for placing that challenge on me. And I don't think I've ever done anything quite like that again. But it was it was validating to realize that you could come up with a nice piece of music. But of course, it also helps to have amazing musicians who were able to first of all, they had the patience to just sit there while I was coming up with stuff. But I was also grateful that I had no choice. The challenge was to come up with something right then. So I didn't have the choice to second guess decisions much. It was just write something right now, write some sort of accompaniment to it. Okay, that's done. Now write the next section. It was just this very quick thing, and within a couple of hours we had a couple of songs. It was really fun.
I meant to bring this down. It's the CD I have is upstairs, and you mentioned XTC a while ago. I have a copy of Wingbeat Fantastic that you did with Andy Partridge from 2012, I think it was. And I'm a huge XTC fan, huge Andy Partridge fan. And there's another guy who, in a way, like Frank Zappa, although they're very different composers and songwriters, but is a guy who has a very own unique way of writing music, seeing music in visuals, and then applying it to whatever musical score he is looking to do at the time. It's an amazing way of working. Tell me about that record and writing with him, and what you learned from a guy like that. There had to be an education there too.
Well, yeah, especially. I mean, I when I first started hearing XTC in the 80s, it was at a time where there was a lot of 80s music was a lot of it was really computerized, mechanized sounding, and it felt like, as somebody who always was appreciative of songcraft, and I always loved Todd Rundgren's music, and I and the Beatles for that matter, just pop songs that had a lot of strong harmonic content, interesting chord progressions, coming out of the Magnus chord organ background, and then beautiful melodies, and then interesting lyrics too. So I was grateful in the 80s when I started finding isolated musicians that seemed to pop up out of the fabric of the time. And I remember seeing the Senses Working Overtime video on MTV and just going, man, this is really this stands apart from, first of all, it was acoustic guitar based, and that wasn't something I was hearing a lot of at the time. And the sound of his voice just grabbed me. It was the moment I heard him go, hey, whoa, what's going on here? And then as the song progressed, and it was going through all these different sections with genuine, interesting chord changes and modulations from section to section,
and building on top of it.
building, and and by the time it finally got to that last chorus, I'm, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I was like, holy, this is amazing. It really I'm getting chills thinking about it. And so fast forward a few years, and I'm on the road with Zappa, and Scott Tunis, the bass player, is as huge as an XTC fan as I am. We were in England doing a series of shows with Frank, and he calls up Virgin Records and extends the invitation to, he said, hi, I'm Scott Tunis with the Zappa band. I just wanted to let you know if you could pass on to the members of, I was in the hotel room when he made this call. If you could pass on to the members of XTC, they're all cordially invited to any Frank Zappa show that we do while we're in the UK. And at the time, I thought it was like, this is like a practical joke. You might as well be ordering pizzas to be delivered to their doorstep. There's no way. Andy, who's had years before given up live performance, and we didn't know at that point if he was even leaving his home. There's no way that Andy's going to show up at the show. Well, in Birmingham, Andy Partridge and Dave Gregory came out to the show, and we were astonished to just see them there. And they were so generous, and they loved the show, and we hung out backstage, and holy cow, this is Andy and Dave, and they're just guys, and they said, well, we're going to be in Los Angeles making a new album in a few months. You should come hang out. Okay, so when they were making Oranges and Lemons, Tunis and I were in the studio just like hanging out as much as we could. So I watched them make the record, which is, to me, was as significant as if the Beatles had said, hey, we're about to make this record called Sgt. Pepper if you want to drop by. It was right. An amazing thing. So we all became friends at that point, and I would stay in touch with Andy through the years, and neither of us can remember which one of us suggested we try writing together finally, 20 years later or whatever. But it was 2006 when I finally went over to his house in the UK for a week. And then 2 years later, I went back and did it again. And we just put together a series of songs. I was sort of like his modeling clay. Like he would say, okay, give me a chord. And I would say, all right. And I would play a chord. He goes, change that one note. And okay. And then he goes, okay, now for this next chord, just move up a bit. And then I would play 2 chords, and he'd say, those 2 chords together make me think of blah. And then that would be like the topic for that song. What really gets me about Frank is how, synesthesia, where music is not just music. It suggests colors. It can suggest feelings in a very specific way. Andy's that way more than anybody else I've ever worked with. And then his ability to write lyrics is just so enviable. If you give him a topic like ants, the song Across This Ant, okay, write a song about ants. He will then approach the topic of ants from every possible angle, and brilliantly and with wit, and it's moving. It's like he tickles your brain and your heart at the same time, and all this stuff. And at the same time, the content of the music is so. Like he always said, he wanted to make records that were so good they hurt. And I completely resonated with that. And I've actually tried to do the same thing with my own albums. So I just related to Andy on so many levels. It was an amazing thing to write songs with him. And we've discussed doing it again now that we're 10 years out from the release of that album. It seems like it's time to do it again. It's just about making the time to do it.
I've interviewed him, Colin, and Dave Gregory now. And because why not? And I'm talking to Andy, and we're discussing some songs, and in my head I know, okay, this guy hasn't performed live since 1982, and it didn't end well, and we're talking, and all of a sudden, oh, hold on, let me get my guitar, and he pulls out his guitar and he starts playing, and I'm like, holy shit, Andy Partridge is playing a concert for me, and I just thought like it was like the coolest thing, and it's that kind of the synesthesia thing I just find so interesting. It's like, how does a guy how does he express music like that? I mean, it's a wiring issue in his mind. But if there's
it's that way with every musician. Every musician has their own unique way in which they interrelate with the act of music making. But when you come into contact with somebody who's just clearly touched by some form of divine inspiration, even though Andy would bridle at that description of it. It's humbling, and it feels like a gift to be able to work and create with somebody like that.
You mentioned that you're working on a new album, or that you have an album in the works. Tell me about how far into it you are, and when you expect to be releasing something.
It's I'd always, I put together a lot of material, and Andy actually was a huge help with it, because he's obviously has become quite masterful at home recording, and he's got a certain amount of justifiable pride in his mixing chops, his engineering chops. So he's like, well, send me your mixes as you're doing them, because I put together a new home rig once the pandemic was underway. Obviously I wasn't going to be doing gigs, so I had to do something. So put together a very basic home studio setup, and as I was coming to terms with what it meant to actually mix, because I always relied on other engineers to mix things well. I was sending my mixes in progress to Andy, and he was just absolutely selfless with his time. And I ended up with a completed first disc, because I still think in terms of physical product, and a bunch of material towards the second disc. But now that we're gigging again, now that everyone's leaving their homes, my time to complete the second disc has been radically shortened. So now I'm thinking I don't want to make the first disc wait for the second disc to be done. So I'm actually having a conversation this week with Scott Chatfield, who runs the record label we have called XOX, to decide what to do about the first disc, which is actually this perfectly serviceable standalone 9-song, 42-minute complete album statement. And I think we're going to find some way to release just the first album sometime in the next couple of months. I'm very happy with it, and the response from people who I've played it for has been has been validating, which means a lot, since it's the first album that I put out as a self-contained pandemic era album maker. So we're not ready to announce a release date yet, but there's definitely something.
But it's coming. Good. Well, Mike,
I think I might have to run, because I was supposed to start another interview about 10 minutes ago. So sorry about that.
Well, listen, it's my pleasure to talk to you, and best of luck with the Zappa Band. Can't wait for the new record. And again, you're coming to Holyoke on June 14th, and at the Narrows in Fall River on the 24th. Mike, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you very much.
So there you go, the ridiculously talented Mike Keneally. I hope you like the show. If you do, please share it, rate it, tell all your friends, subscribe to it. You can reach me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to know what you think. Thanks again to Canna Provisions for their support, and you can support them in Holyoke and in Lee, Massachusetts, or at cannaprovisions.com. And thanks again for joining us on Baxi's Musical Podcast.